Will the US be dragged into war? I sometimes take questions on my Instagram stories, and while I usually answer by writing, which I already did in this case, I'm particularly inspired to make a video to answer this question. We are Thursday, June 19th, 2025. 6 days ago, Israel launched its largest ever strike on Iran, an unprecedented aerial assault targeting nuclear facilities, IRGC command centers, and air defense systems across the country. Key Iranian military leaders were killed, nuclear centrifuge networks disabled, and state media bombed during a live broadcast, not to mention the civilians who were killed. In response, Iran launched an unprecedented wave of missiles and drones at Israel, striking Tel Aviv, Haifa, and other major cities. And now many are wondering if the United States will be dragged into war. And this is my answer. The United States will not be dragged into war. The United States has been plotting for this war for a long time. It is its architect. Saying it's being dragged is like saying P. Diddy got dragged to his own parties. He's the host. And the US is the architect of this war, not a reluctant participant. Let me explain. One of the great misconceptions about the United States is the belief that the president is the ultimate decision maker, akin to an emperor or a king in the classical sense. No, the decision maker is not Donald Trump, nor has any other president before him ever held control over US foreign policy. The decision maker or architect of US foreign policy is the national security state. What does this mean? The organs of the shallow and deep state. The Pentagon, the headquarters of the US military, the State Department, the US equivalent of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the CIA, and the intelligence community. And layered beneath them are the corporate and military industrial lobbies and powerful interest groups, oil and Israel, AIPAC and beyond. One could even include the hidden influence of secretive networks, Freemasons and other underground elites, some very, very dark, all embedded together. Think Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex trafficker, alleged Mossad agent, and operator of a global blackmail ring involving underage girls. The Epstein Files are still sealed by US courts, allegedly containing the names of presidents, royals, billionaires, and intelligence operatives, all accused of rape, abuse, and trafficking of children. You know, the same files Elon Musk recently accused Trump of being in before quietly deleting the tweet. Read with me. Time to drop the really big bomb. Donald Trump is in the Epstein Files. That is the real reason they have not been made public. Have a nice day, Donald J. Trump. You see, this is not fantasy. It's part of the constellation of power that surrounds, insulates, and protects the system. That is the national security state. The president is not the architect. At best, he's a rotating spokesperson for interests that are far more permanent than his ego. And often, he owes his power, his protection, and his silence to the very deep networks that put him there. Okay? Even though campaign trails are filled with partisan rhetoric and dramatic contrasts, it's all theater. U.S. foreign policy has remained remarkably consistent across administrations, Republican or Democrat, Dove or Hawk. The illusion of change from one president to the next is a performance staged for voters. Voters too busy trying to stay out of a hospital that would bankrupt them to notice that it's exactly the same policy repackaged every 4 years. I'm not even kidding. If the American people were not drowning in medical debt, they might actually have time and clarity to notice the con. However, unfortunately for the entire world, the American people are still at the mercy of the performance. But in reality, it's a continuum. The actors rotate, the language shifts, but the direction stays the same. And I will prove this to you if you follow this thread. Take Biden, who came after Trump. He kept nearly all of Trump's major foreign policies, even though he ran on an agenda opposing them. For example, Biden did not rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, despite his campaign promise vowing to restore the Iran nuclear deal. Biden kept the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem even after his opposition to move the Israel Embassy. Biden maintained Trump's maximum pressure sanctions on Iran despite pledging a return to diplomacy. Biden criticized Trump's anti-China tariff strategy, calling the move short-sighted. Well, he not only kept Trump's China policy and the tariffs, he added new ones. And though he oversaw the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it was executed under the terms of Trump's 2020 Doha Agreement, not a shift in doctrine, but a continuation of it. Now take Trump, who came after Obama, criticizing him endlessly, calling him weak on foreign policy. So much for all his, America First noise. Well, Trump continued Obama's drone warfare programs, expanded them as he ditched accountability, even though he repeatedly criticized Obama for having weakened the U.S. military for relying on that very policy. Trump did not leave NATO, despite repeated campaign promises and literal threats to withdraw from NATO. Trump escalated tensions with Iran after unilaterally withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, even though he kept insisting that he did not want a war with Iran. Trump also repeatedly accused Obama of planning to start a war with Iran, tweeting nonstop over several years that Obama would attack Iran to get elected, to save face, or to show how tough he is. Well, here are the tweets. I took all of these screenshots myself from @RealDonaldTrump's X account, so I personally can confirm that they're real. In order to get elected, Barack Obama will start a war with Iran. Now that Obama's poll numbers are in a tailspin, watch for him to launch a strike in Libya or Iran. He is desperate. I predict that President Obama will at some point attack Iran in order to save face. Remember what I previously said, Obama will someday attack Iran in order to show how tough he is. Except that Trump is the one who started the war with Iran. And he also said this too.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective.
Okay. Now take Obama after Bush. To millions, Obama felt like a real turning point, promising a reset, a return in principle and diplomacy. But once he was in office, he carried forward the exact same wars, the same surveillance, and the same imperial playbook that he had once vowed to close. He continued Bush's national security state after campaigning against it. Obama also continued Bush's opaque drone strikes policy and mass surveillance programs, even though Obama promised transparency on drones and announced plans to scale back U.S. drone strikes, all to no avail. Obama also failed to close Guantanamo, despite making it a cornerstone campaign promise, presenting a plan to close Guantanamo and renewing the vow to close Guantanamo Bay over and over again. Obama also deepened the war in Afghanistan, ordering a major troop surge that prolonged the conflict, even though he repeatedly claimed that ending the war was a core goal of his foreign policy legacy. And now finally take Bush after Clinton. You may not know this or remember, but Bush criticized the Clinton administration for overextending U.S. military commitments, as he repeated his pledge to review all overseas deployments. "We let our friends be the peacekeepers," he said. "The great country called America will be the peacemakers." Only to launch the most aggressive regime change wars of the century. Only 3 years into his Iraq war, by 2006, almost 1 million Iraqis were estimated to have been killed on the upper margin as per this Lancet report. Bush inherited and expanded Clinton's sanctions regime on Iran and Iraq, despite calling for a humble foreign policy, only to turn around and launch a full-scale invasion, one that had been in the works well before 9/11, built entirely on lies. I highly encourage you to watch my Iraq War video called Brutal Lessons from the Iraq War. Thank you for nearly 1 million views on Instagram alone. If you haven't watched it, I urge you to go to my Instagram or YouTube channel and watch it. Now, just like they did with Iraq, the US is doing the same with Iran now. Now, as for those who say, people should have voted for Kamala, she would have given us a different scenario. No, she would not have. Kamala Harris said, "All options on the table to stop Iran from going nuclear." That line places her firmly within the bipartisan, deeply entrenched U.S. consensus that Iran must be denied nuclear capability no matter who's in office. If she didn't hold that position, she wouldn't even be allowed to run. Kamala also said, watch this video,
"As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world."
Lethal. Do you know what lethal means? It means able to cause death. She didn't say most strategic or most precise. She chose the word that means death-causing. This woman was selling herself for the presidency by declaring that she wants to command the most able to cause death force on earth. That's how she advertised her leadership. Not through courage or wisdom, but through her willingness to wield death. They conditioned much of the American public to believe that killing and destroying civilian lives across the world is something to be proud of, that this violence somehow affirms your identity as an American. Never forget, 72% of Americans supported the war against Iraq. And that conditioning is the work of a media machine that serves the deep state. So no, U.S. presidents cannot rewrite the architecture of foreign policy. They can only perform for it. And if they try to change it, they might get killed. And this was the fate of JFK. Yes, I say that with full lucidity. JFK was killed because he challenged the deep state machinery. And I'm going to explain how, because it is necessary for all of us to understand the dark chapters of U.S. history, because these chapters are not in the past. They keep getting replayed, just with different names, different faces, and different timelines, but they directly affect all of us everywhere in the world, even if you never set foot in the United States. But if enough people understand this, it becomes harder for them to pull it off. That is why education and knowledge is the most effective form of resistance. So I'll start by saying this. JFK refused to authorize Operation Northwoods, one of the most important declassified documents that will help you understand how the U.S. national security state operates. In 1962, the U.S. Department of Defense, which is the federal agency that oversees the entire military apparatus, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the top military leaders from each branch of the armed forces, they drafted a top secret plan called Operation Northwoods. It proposed that the United States military carry out violent attacks against American civilians and military targets staged to look like they were done by Cuba, to give pretext for a war against Cuba. The suggested actions included, and this is straight from the CIA declassified document, look how psycho this is. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Hijacking against civil aircraft. Attack and shoot down a chartered civil airliner. This means, by the way, a commercial civilian plane. And check this out. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots in the U.S. to create casualties. All of this to fabricate evidence to make it appear Cuba was behind it all to manipulate public opinion and justify U.S. military intervention. But this was not new. This came after President John F. Kennedy had already authorized Operation Mongoose, also known as the Cuban Project, an extensive campaign of CIA-led terrorist attacks against civilians in Cuba and covert operations aimed at destabilizing Cuba. That operation was officially approved on November 30th, 1961, by Kennedy himself. But at that point, this deep state was satisfied. Kennedy was playing along. But the operation failed. Castro remained in power, U.S.-Cuba tensions increased, and contributed to the conditions that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. So the deep state brought forth new plans. Let's kill a group of American college students. Let's plant bombs in U.S. cities. Let's attack our own ships to launch geopolitical wars. Well, Kennedy refused to authorize Operation Northwoods, and that's when he began falling out of favor. JFK kept going off script. JFK wanted to end the Cold War, pursuing secret back channels with Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis, delivering his famous American University speech calling for peace with the USSR. Oh, for the deep state. That was a betrayal of Cold War doctrine. JFK was pulling out of Vietnam, having planned total withdrawal by 1965. For the deep state, that was a betrayal of Cold War doctrine. In fact, 4 days after JFK was killed, his own vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, reversed this plan and escalated massively, to the extent that they staged the Gulf of Tonkin incident, fabricating attacks on U.S. Navy ships by North Vietnamese forces in August 1964 to justify massive U.S. military escalation in Vietnam. I wrote about this. You can find it in my Instagram highlight called Media Lies and Wars, where I show you how the media keeps lying to create wars for the deep state. JFK took on the CIA after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961. When the US-backed invasion of Cuba failed miserably, JFK famously said that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He increasingly sidelined intelligence agencies, favoring personal channels. Well, for the deep state, that was a betrayal. Finally, JFK demanded a full inspection of Israel's Dimona nuclear reactor, insisting that U.S. support for Israel would be conditional on transparency about its nuclear program. He made this clear in a May 1963 letter to Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, pressing for regular direct access for American inspectors. Israel's secretive development at Dimona alarmed Kennedy, who warned that U.S. support for Israel would be jeopardized without nuclear inspections. Now, some historians argue that this firm stance of his on Dimona may have contributed to powerful interests finally turning against him, a final red line that he crossed. So on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, a little less than 3 years after he was sworn into office. The Warren Commission blamed Lee Harvey Oswald for the kill, but Oswald himself was immediately shot dead after. Today, researchers say Oswald did not fire the fatal shot. Well, to this day, no consensus exists on who truly killed the allegedly most powerful man in the world, in the most powerful nation in the world, which is frankly implausible. The same happened to JFK's younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, who was following in his older brother's footsteps politically and running for president. Moments after emerging as the clear front-runner for the Democratic nomination, RFK was assassinated on June 5, 1968, 4 months before the presidential election of 1968. He was allegedly killed by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian Christian. But the official story is riddled with contradictions. Forensic evidence does not match, and witness testimonies conflict, to the extent that RFK's own son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has publicly said Sirhan didn't kill his father, and has called for a new investigation. RFK Jr. serves today as United States Secretary of Health and Human Services under Trump. You will probably never see a Hollywood movie about any of this, because the Pentagon and the deep state dictate what Hollywood does. If the United States existed outside of itself, it would invade itself and orchestrate a regime change to save the American people from their own government. But regime changes happen only in the global south. Do you remember this video?
We as Muslims stand with President Trump because he promises peace. He promises peace, not war. We are supporting Donald Trump because he promised to end war in the Middle East and Ukraine.
This was on the campaign trail. I think about this video probably every day. A man of peace. Some people believed this. You know, even if Trump ever meant to be a man of peace, and let's be clear, he did not, but just imagine that deep down he truly believed it, he would never be allowed to become one. In this job, you are obliged to worship violence, to support genocide, to actively starve children, and provide unconditional support for apartheid and war crimes. I'm not just talking about the Holocaust of Gaza today, where numerous Western doctors came back to report that children were getting sniped in their chests and heads and dying of hunger while nobody in the US media reports it. But never forget that in 1996, Madeleine Albright, then US ambassador to the United Nations, later Clinton's Secretary of State, was asked by journalist Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes about the estimated 500,000 Iraqi children who died as a result of US-led sanctions on Iraq. Stahl asked Albright if the price was worth it. Albright said, "We think the price is worth it." Watch.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
A statement like this does not come from a moment of confusion. She doesn't even feel shame. To admit openly to being a murderer of the most defenseless lives imaginable requires a genocidal logic so entrenched, so normalized, that it becomes pathology. Mass murder is a policy tool. The US national security state dictates this. The same national security state that has been willing to kill Americans. The plan was to kill a group of American college students to launch geopolitical wars. Do you hear this? The playbook has not changed, and in my opinion, they tell you how far they're willing to go. Look at this New York Times headline. Trump says he left instructions to obliterate Iran if it assassinates him. This assassination by Iran keeps getting mentioned. This week, in an interview with Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz was caught off guard when Carlson asked him a basic question. What's the population of Iran, the country he's calling to go to war with? Cruz could not answer. And instead of reflecting, he snapped and he said,
"You don't know anything about the country. You're the one who claims they're not trying to murder Donald Trump."
Yeah. Well, before he won the election last September, Trump also tweeted, "Big threats on my life by Iran." Don't be surprised if that actually happens. And let me be clear, this is absolutely not a wishful thought. His assassination would be a catastrophe, a regional and global trigger, but it would be entirely consistent with the modus operandi of the deep state. Foreign policy is shaped by a permanent institutional machine, not elected officials, and that machine runs on its own agenda, and it will sacrifice who it needs to sacrifice. It is a machine that is extremely deadly, lethal, but it's also not very smart. It lurches from blunder to blunder, never achieving its stated goals. In fact, every campaign it launches only accelerates the decline of American hegemony. And this Iranian scenario is no exception. It's the Iraq scenario all over again. Never forget, Saddam was once a US ally. Then the US turned on him, starved the Iraqi people with brutal sanctions, which was worth it.
Price is worth it.
Under the pretense that Saddam was hiding weapons of mass destruction, even though he had already complied with international weapons inspections and disarmament protocols. Later, the US invaded Iraq under those same false pretenses, chasing WMDs that they admitted never existed, despite the fact that Saddam consistently played ball. Well, the same playbook is unfolding with Iran today. This time the excuse is a nuclear weapon, one that even US intelligence agencies admit does not exist. As current Director of National Intelligence under Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, pointed out, Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Please watch this video.
How close do you personally think that they were to getting one, because Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having it.
He doesn't care what his own director of national intelligence says, because facts never mattered to an empire in search of its next war. The war against Iran is a war that the deep state of the United States has been planning to wage for a long time in concordance with Israel, who is also embedded in the deep state. It was never a question of if. It was only a question of when and how. Maybe at first the US is more likely to send bombers, destroy infrastructure, and try to cripple Iran from the air without committing to regime change or boots on the ground. Maybe at least that's at first. But here's the danger. Iran won't take it lying down. And that response through Hezbollah, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, oil fields could quickly spiral into a wider war that the US will never be able to fully control. Iran has double the population of Iraq. Iran is almost 4 times larger than Iraq in terms of geography. Its military, intelligence, and militia networks are deeply entrenched across 5 countries. If it collapses, those networks don't vanish. They fracture, go rogue, turn on against each other, and burn everything around them. Iran also sits on the world's most critical oil choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Chaos there means global economic havoc, not just regional disorder. And also, Iran is not one bloc. It's Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, Turkmen. A power vacuum means civil war, ethnic cleansing, breakaway regions, and massacres like post-Saddam Iraq, but across a much wider and more volatile territory. And what might happen next is pure devastation. Famine in the Iranian interior, mass migration waves to Europe and Central Asia. Oil prices have surged about 4.4% this week, now hovering in the mid-$70. If tensions keep escalating, what might happen is oil at $150 a barrel. Not to mention sectarian bloodbaths from, Pakistan all the way to Syria. Yes, Iran's regime is authoritarian, repressive, and guilty of countless abuses, and when time allows, I'll address this in a future video. The regime does not deserve your sympathy, but the Iranian people do. The collapse of their country under this kind of assault would set fire to them, with millions of civilians paying the highest price. It would be Iraq multiplied, Libya multiplied, Syria multiplied, and it has already begun. Do not be callous to the fallen. They have mothers, fathers, spouses, sons, and daughters who will spend the rest of their devastated lives mourning them. So why is the US deep state so adamant on this war? Saying Iran is an authoritarian regime that must not have a nuclear weapon, that's propaganda cover. Not a real reason to risk global war. If it were simply about authoritarianism or nuclear capability, then why does no one touch North Korea? Because North Korea does not interfere with Israel, nor threaten Western imperial control of the Middle East, a colonial appellation. So we will end on this note. Israel is deeply embedded in the US deep state. The CIA and Mossad maintain the closest intelligence sharing relationship in the world, so close that Israel is looped into classified briefings before NATO allies. Israel has unmatched access to US weapons systems and billions upon billions of US dollars in aid. Through AIPAC and affiliated lobbies, Israel effectively shapes US legislation and dictates political messaging word for word. Mainstream US media adopts a pro-Israel framing more aggressive than Israel's own press inside Israel, silencing criticism and completely whitewashing Israeli war crimes. Israel is not an ally of the United States. It is a major stakeholder in the architecture of American power. Its influence runs so deep, so structurally entrenched, that Israel has become a fixture of the US deep state itself. And within the deep layers of the US national security state, intelligence, military, surveillance, lobbying, and the media, the distinction between the US and Israel is functionally non-existent. They are one and the same. And Israel, as designed by the Western deep states, is an expansionist, settler colonial, genocidal entity that depends on chaos to carry out its psychopathic policies, and I use the word psychopathic deliberately because this is not hyperbole. Please listen to this Jewish-American orthopedic surgeon who testified that Israeli snipers deliberately target children.
There's not a doc that's been there that probably can't testify that they didn't see kids shot in the head. Bullet holes exactly where I would put a stethoscope. And a second bullet hole directly in the side of a temple. No kid gets shot twice by mistake. When he came to us, he had no organs when I rolled him over. He had no organs. An American football was the size of the hole in the kid's back. Everything between his shoulder blades and every organ in his chest was missing, including his spine. This kid was 6 years old.
Eternal psychopathic war is the strategy of survival. An apartheid state that commits genocide and that institutionalizes policies to kill children cannot coexist in a stable, integrated Middle East. It needs the region fractured by war, fear, and militarization so it can point to its neighbors as the threat, deflect from within, and win every expansionist contest by default with endless U.S. deep state money, weapons, and impunity. Israel can only survive and continue its apartheid and genocide if lethal disorder is the region's design, especially when it is surrounded by nations that overwhelmingly reject its criminal modus operandi. That is why the same principle that was used against those nations, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Sudan and Somalia, what the Pentagon once called 7 wars in 5 years, is now finally being deployed against Iran. Watch former NATO commander Wesley Clark explain it so you can understand what I'm talking about.
Right after 9/11, when I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir."
There is a strategic blueprint being executed through the military-industrial deep state complex. Now, some pundits will try to obscure this reality by pointing to the authoritarian and brutal nature of the regimes targeted. And they're not wrong. But that authoritarianism is the consequence of Zionism and Western imperialism activity in the region. A region suffocated by colonial violence, endless war, and foreign domination will inevitably produce regimes hardened by siege. And those regimes in turn harden against their own people. As long as Zionism remains embedded in the region's architecture, authoritarianism will remain its shadow. And that is the deep state's desire. I came across this ironic tweet that summarizes it really so well. I don't know the person behind this tweet. I'm not endorsing their broader politics, but I do agree with what they said here. Let us read. Gentle reminder that ISIS was created by the U.S. government to fight the Shiite militants, who were armed by the U.S. government to fight Saddam, who was armed by the U.S. government to fight Iran, who hates us because the U.S. government overthrew their elected leader and installed a brutal dictator. And so, the plan for the decisive containment of Iran began 6 days ago. Preserving Israeli dominance and Western hegemony always being the cornerstone of managing the region through accelerated militarization. In practice, this means chaos, division, and endless war, because only through lethal chaos can the Western deep state's hegemony be preserved. And only in that chaos can an apartheid state survive, commit genocide, and expand. Which brings me to my final announcement. I have 3 huge videos that I've been working on for months, all on this very topic, and they're ready to drop. I was supposed to release them this past weekend, but the 7th US-Israeli deep state planned war momentarily paused my posting. But those videos are coming soon to a screen near you, and they're built to shed light on exactly this. Stay informed, and I'm here to help you connect the dots. Onwards and upwards.